Hey everybody, welcome back to our second series on argument. I want to remind you at the beginning, our mentor text for this series is by Ta-Nihisi. It's called Civil Rights Protests Have Never Been Popular. There is a link to it down in the description. And you may be wondering about the title of this particular episode. Well, it's a reference to a metaphor that we are going to see right after the theme song. So in episode 1 of this series, I said something about when you're defining your terms that you go to authorities who are actually authorities on the subject that you were talking about, and I said I would get more into detail on that later, and now is later. And I'm going to start with a quote from Kenneth Burke. It's going to be a dense block of text. I'm going to put it up on the screen. I'm not going to read it out loud to you. So I want you to hit pause, and I want you to read it, and then I want you to hit play, and I'm going to talk about what it meant. What Kenneth Burke is trying to say there is simply, you are not the first person to make the argument that you're making or to talk about the thing that you are talking about. And the title of the episode is a riff on his part there at the end about how you gently dip in your oar and start navigating the waters of this conversation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this episode is really about Bullock's fourth rule of argument. You are not the first. Creating a web series like this and just being an English teacher, I myself owe a lot to the people who have come before me, including dead white dudes like Kenneth Burke and live white people like Graff and Dean, who wrote the book They Say, I Say. This is a very helpful book. I have recommended it repeatedly. There will be a link so that you can buy one for yourself down in the description. But they are people who have come before me, and they are people who have talked about the very things that I'm trying to get across to you. Now, obviously, I am not just sitting here and reading They Say, I Say out loud to you. I didn't even bring my copy of the book home from school to record this episode. But I still owe a lot to what they have said. And the whole premise of the book, They Say, I Say, is that you're the I in the title, is that you, when you are writing, you need to think about and acknowledge what they have said. And they might be very specific authors that you are talking about and referencing, but they might also be the world at large. This is what people believe in general, or this is what I've learned from reading public opinion polls, or this is what somebody is saying in the news and how people feel about things. So as we get into this episode on argument, I'm going to talk about how you are not the first should really be guiding the way you think about and the way you credit those who came before you. So an easy way to acknowledge to yourself and to your readers that you are not the first is to include what they say in what you are saying. I mean, in They Say, I Say is half the battle, apparently. Now, our mentor text by Ta-Nihisi, how does he do this? Well, take a look at his very first sentence. One common response to the national anthem protests originated by Colin Kaepernick is to disparage them as polarizing. So in his very first sentence, he says, they say this. Now, there is a logical fallacy, and I'm going to talk a lot more about logical fallacies in episode 6 of this series. But there is a logical fallacy that's called the straw man. The gist of that fallacy is that you invent an argument used by your opponents, except it's not really used by your opponents, you've made it up. And that argument that you've invented is a lot easier to argue against and defeat than what your opponents are actually saying. You might see things phrased as, some people say this. And Ta-Nihisi's one common response verges on being a straw man, except he backs it up. And it's no accident that Ta-Nihisi makes appear in its entirety Joe Scarborough's tweet. And it's also no accident that he quotes 2 paragraphs out of David Leonhardt's writing. Because one of the ways that you can demonstrate that other people have been talking about this is to use their own words. Now, in addition to just knowing that other people have talked about the general subject that you're writing about in your argument, you should also recognize that other people have said things that you agree with or that are evidence for your claim, or even that make a very similar claim to what you do. Ta-Nihisi Coates knows this, and so of course he quotes civil rights activists who can verify that civil rights protests have never been popular. He quotes Joyce Ladner and he quotes Julian Bond. So he's not only going with people who have talked about this who are wrong, he's going with people who have talked about this who agree with him. Now, you also need to honor those who came before you. And you might be thinking to yourself, how exactly is Ta-Nihisi Coates honoring David Leonhardt when he basically says, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong? Well, he honors him by using his words verbatim. One of the most important things that you need to know about writing and about arguments in general is that you can't change the meaning of what somebody else has said. Now, for Ta-Nihisi Coates, this manifests in a couple of different ways. Number one, he is writing for the Atlantic magazine. I think this was just a web piece, didn't go in the magazine, but his longer pieces that do go in the magazine, the Atlantic has a fact-checking process. They're going to call every source that Coates talked to and verify, did you say this? Is this your quote? When he's got you word for word, is this what you said? They're going to go back and read the print sources that Coates referred to. If Coates is referring to scientific studies, they're going to read those studies and make sure that Coates is representing them accurately. And if they need to, they will call other experts in the field to say, this is what he says about the study, is this true? Now, you don't have a fact-checking department at your disposal. You are a high school student. You do have teachers, you do have adults, you have mentors, you even have smarter friends. Let's be honest, no matter how smart you are, you know there's that one person in your school who is smarter than you, and you can ask them questions and they will tell you things that you never knew. So you can use other people as your fact-checking department. Hey, I read this, I think this is what it means, am I right? The second way to honor those who have come before you, if number one is making sure you understand and making sure you quote accurately and making sure you summarize or paraphrase accurately, number two is making sure your audience for your argument knows where this information came from. Coates also provides links, hyperlinks. There's Joe Scarborough's tweet. He's linked to it there. He links directly to David Leonhardt's piece so that his readers can go and double check. Is he being fair to David Leonhardt? He provides a link to the Washington Post story where he got the quotes from Ladner and Bond. So you honor those who came before you by being true and correct about what they're saying, by telling your reader where that information came from. But, okay, you're writing a research paper. You're writing an argument on paper by hand for class. You can't just do hyperlinks. Well, there are a number of different well-established, consistent ways to cite sources, both within the text as you are writing and then at the end in a bibliography of some sort. Your teacher probably has one that he or she prefers. For me, it's MLA style. I like to see, here's the quote or the paraphrase, parentheses, the name of the author, the page number, where it came from, and then at the end a works cited list where you put all of those sources. However it is that you do it, if it's APA style, if it's Chicago style, whatever style it is that you are using, even if you're just making one up and using it consistently, you have to be able to let your readers know, I am so confident in what I'm saying about this source and how I'm representing this source that you can go and take a look for yourself and try to prove me wrong. And finally, an important part of recognizing that you are not the first is that you need to try to move beyond all of those things that other people have already said. If you go back to Kenneth Burke's metaphor about dipping your oar into the waters, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for you only to say the things that are already in the water. Okay? There's a lot of water. It doesn't matter what you're writing about. You could be writing about a tweet that you saw yesterday. You could be writing about Shakespeare. There's water there. And what you need to make sure that you do is that you can add something unique and special and interesting to it that can only come from you. Now, Ta-Nihisi Coates adds to what came before with his appearing very late in the essay thesis, where he says, you know what, civil rights protests weren't popular, but that's okay. They were never trying to change the minds of the white people who were adults and decision makers at the time. They were trying to reach the children. Their target was the future, he says. That's what he's adding to the conversation. That's what David Leonhardt didn't say. That's what Joe Scarborough didn't say. That's what Joyce Ladner didn't say. That's what Julian Bond didn't say. This is what Ta-Nihisi Coates says. This is what he's adding to the argument. It's what he's adding to the water so that he can distinguish himself and he can add to what all came before. Now, for you, you're a high school student. You are not a columnist for The Atlantic where you're expected to make all of these grand public intellectual proclamations. But you can still put your personal touch on any argument. You can use evidence that is unique to you, something that you have read that perhaps other people haven't read, something you've seen, something you've experienced. Your evidence can be what you add to the conversation, because maybe your claim is exactly the same as somebody else's claim, but you've got evidence that's different. You can add a particular call to action that is important to you. Maybe you're writing about, I don't know, global warming, right? There's a lot of water out there, and there's a lot more because those ice caps are melting. Huh? Nothing? Okay. But you aren't necessarily going to have new personal experience to add, but you can have a particular call to action, right? My school needs to recycle. My school needs to install solar panels. We need to do this one thing differently in my community where I live so that we can do something about global warming. We're not going to solve it all, you can say. But if we take these small steps right here, we can make a difference. So in your call to action, you can also add to what has come before. So there it is, Bullock's fourth rule of argument. If you were watching episode 1 and thinking 3 rules, I can remember 3 rules, but if there's a 4th, I'm screwed. Well, I'm sorry, there's a 4th. And I really hope that you can figure out how honoring the conversation that came before while adding to it can be a part of your argument writing, both in class and then as you go out into the world as an adult. You know, maybe the arguments you're having on Facebook, what you are doing writing in college. I have no idea what you're going to be when you grow up, but you will probably need to become an expert at something. And you can recognize the work of those who came before while adding to it yourself. And just real quick, a little preview of the next episode. Yes, you have to stake your claim. You have to take a stand. But in an argument, there's also some advantage to making a concession, saying, you know what, the other side says this. And so we'll talk about how to use the concession to make your own argument, your own stand, stronger. I'll see you for the next one. Isn't satisfied with just quoting David Leonhardt. He goes on, that's Grubhub. Should have turned off the volume.